Hey there, and welcome to this new series. This time I'll be walking you through how to design your own productivity system. But to do that, we first need to understand how they're put together, what are the parts, how do they work, how do they fit together, what are they trying to achieve, and once we understand that, we'll be able to put these together using our own set of productivity Lego blocks. In this first video, we'll be taking a look at what I call the primitives, which are the most atomic elements of any productivity system. And if you're watching this video, you're probably already aware of what they are. I think it's still worth going over them and just keeping them in our mind as we progress through the series. So in this video, we're going to take a look at what they are, what they're generally used for, some tips, and then we'll just leave it at that. We really just want to start with a solid base, and then we'll move on to the more, let's say, interesting parts of productivity system design. If you've used any productivity system in the past or are currently using one, you no doubt have had the experience of trying to set it up, follow the instructions of the author or the creator, and then finding that some parts just don't align with the way you want to do things or with the type of work you're trying to do. And so eventually you end up adjusting, modifying the system, adding things, removing some things so that it fits how you want to do things better. And that's great because that means you already have some experience with productivity system architecture. My goal for this series is to give you a general overview of all the different pieces that make up productivity systems, how they fit together, and some of the different ways they're generally combined to solve those problems so that you can then put them together based on your needs. And instead of trying to take one of these already made productivity systems off the shelf and modifying it, you can start from scratch and have a system that suits your needs far better than anything else out there because you put it together yourself. So if that sounds good, let's get started with the primitives. So what do I actually mean by primitives? To me, primitives represent, let's say, 90-something% of productivity systems. These are what I consider the most atomic elements of any productivity system. And while I'm sure you could probably think of a few more that you might consider a primitive, this is the list I came up with, and I feel pretty confident that it covers the majority of the atomic elements you might need for any good productivity system. And like I said, most of these are going to be pretty obvious and you're going to be quite familiar with them, but I think it's still well worth starting at the beginning, making sure we cover all our bases so that when we start looking at how to put these together, we have a solid foundation. We make sure everyone's starting from the same place. So let's talk about inboxes. A good inbox should be a friction-free place to put anything. For the majority of productivity systems, this is going to be the entry point for all the different types of information that make it into your system. And essentially, it's good for making sure you don't forget things or stopping cognitive leakage. Anything you think might have a place in your productivity system, probably going to start right here. When do you use it? All the time. Every single time you have an idea, a note, anything you want to capture that you think might go into your system goes right into the inbox. And obviously there are going to be multiple ways to do that depending on which application you're using. But most note-taking applications are going to have multiple ways, including quick capture, web clippers, emailing them to yourself, or even using voice notes. So the important thing is to make sure that it's easy to put things in your inbox, easy to find the inbox, easy to drop anything in there. If it's not, you're not going to use it, and this is the entry point for your system, so it's very critical that we get this right. Some important tips on using the inbox. You want to make sure you capture first, decide later. This is just for capturing. Generally, you don't do anything else inside the inbox. You don't want to start using it to process things because that's just going to make your system a little bit more messy. It's really only meant to hold new items. Another tip to keep in mind is you generally want to avoid keeping multiple inboxes in your system unless you have a really good reason for doing that. But even so, you're going to want to have a way to process or consolidate them because having multiple entry points into your system that are not connected in any way is kind of a recipe for missing things. And the last tip is just to make sure you schedule some sort of time to sort the inbox, empty it out, go through it and sort everything that needs to be sorted. Otherwise, everything you put in here builds up and it just becomes another dumping ground. Next, we have notes, which are really our first actual element of information in productivity systems. The idea behind them is to store one atomic piece of information, an idea, a fact, a quote, whatever it might be, just some piece of information that you want to go into your system. What's it good for? Well, essentially, this is the backbone of any good productivity system or knowledge base. It's what's holding all the information, so kind of important. And you're going to use it anytime you're recording knowledge or context or anything that you want to store inside your system. Use it later, that was going to be a note. 2 quick tips to keep in mind when you're using notes. Try to stick to one idea per note. Otherwise, it becomes a document. And I do make a distinction between notes and documents. I don't really consider documents to be primitives in a productivity system because for me, at least, those generally feel like they're going to be reference materials. They're going to be either something that is stored in your productivity system or something you are producing with your productivity system, but generally they're not going to hold any important parts of your system within them. So that's just why I don't consider them primitives. And the second one is to make sure you avoid mixing notes and tasks unless you have a way to extract, filter, or view these separately. Otherwise, you're going to end up losing either notes or tasks if you try to mix them together. And I know that that's generally the type of thing we do. We start writing some notes and then they turn into tasks. But you just want to make sure that whatever system or application you're using has some way to somehow parse these. So even if they're right next to each other, you have a way to view just the notes or just the tasks. Next, we have tasks or to-dos or next actions. These can have various names. And obviously the purpose of these is to note some concrete action that someone needs to take to move things forward, whatever that might be. So whenever we're using tasks, we are trying to drive behavior, and we can also obviously use them to track progress. And we're going to use these whenever an item requires some sort of discrete action. There's a thing that needs to be done by someone, it's going to use a task. Some general tips around tasks are to make sure that they're clear and actionable. Writing vague descriptions is a great way to make sure that whoever's handling them, and that's probably going to be you, is going to be confused, and it's much more likely you're going to avoid that task. So it's worth spending a little bit of time just to make sure you think about what it is you're trying to achieve with the task and making sure you write a description that matches that. Like the notes, you want to keep tasks to one action per task. If you have a task that really is multiple steps in a task, one, the task is probably not written very clearly, and two, you're probably going to want to break it up into multiple steps. And again, the reason for that is because it makes it much easier to follow one step after the other if they're much smaller, much more discrete, and they're written clearly. And if you are writing tasks with multiple steps, you want to make sure that at least the next immediate action is clear. Maybe you're writing a task that has 10 or 15 or 20 steps. You don't have to figure them all out at the very beginning, but you do need to have at least the next immediate action. So whenever you start working on that task, you know what you need to do, and you don't have to spend time getting the context and figuring out what was it that I needed to do next. Because you can imagine a task with multiple steps is probably going to take you much more time, maybe multiple days. And so you'll come back to the task. And if you have a clearly defined next immediate action, it's going to be much easier for you to continue with this task and not spend time trying to figure out what it is that you need to do. Next, we have projects. And projects really just represent a defined outcome, some sort of a goal that requires multiple tasks. So we create projects generally just to coordinate activities that are more complex, require multiple steps, and usually are going to have much more information that is part of the context of the activity. Basically, it's whenever you're doing something that requires multiple tasks or spans a longer period of time than a single day. Projects are an easy way to make sure that we have all the relevant information, documents, context in one single place, so it's easier for anyone working on that project to actually achieve it because they have all the information they need to do it. The only real tip I have for projects is that you should have clearly stated tasks, just as we saw in the previous primitive. If it's important enough for multi-step tasks, it's doubly more important for projects that the tasks are clearly stated and defined, that you or anyone working on the project always knows what they're supposed to do next to move that project forward. Next, we have folders or notebooks or buckets. Essentially, they provide a single home, a way to group all the different documents that are related somehow. And this also allows us to better control access to these documents by keeping them together in one single place. It allows us to manage their permissions much more easily. Folders are great for keeping related items together, however you want to group them, whether that's by topic, area, project, etc. You'll notice how I consider projects and folders to be separate primitives. While you could argue that projects are a type of a folder, I do consider that the way you use them is very different. And so even though on the surface they might look the same, a project is just like a type of a folder, I think they're different enough that it's worth considering them as separate things. Projects are generally where action is happening. They hold tasks, they coordinate activities. Folders could do that, but generally are just used to store information. So while they look the same, they do have very different purposes, and that's why I consider them separate primitives. So you would use folders whenever you need to group items that share the same theme, the same goal, the same purpose. Some things to keep in mind when using folders is that generally you want to use folders for high-level grouping. That's obviously going to depend on what you're using your productivity system for, but broadly speaking, when I talk about high-level grouping, I'm really talking about those big categories that don't really change. If we were taking a look at your productivity system today, or in 1 year, or in 5 years, probably we're going to find the exact same high-level categories, the same folders that we would see today. So whatever those might be for you, that's probably what's going to be a folder. Now for everything else, you're going to want to use tags for what I call the lower level grouping. And so these are going to be the things that are influx throughout the day or the week that are going to be changing. And so this is what you would use tags for. You generally don't want to use folders for that sort of thing. And lastly, I would also advise that you keep the folder depth pretty shallow, at most just 2-3 levels max. This is just for convenience. I'm sure you, like everybody else, has that experience of trying to find some folder on your computer and being unable to because it is the 10th folder down in some obscure drive. And so it's just very difficult to find the information you're looking for. So to avoid that, stick to just 2 to 3 levels max. Moving on, we have the event or the calendar entry. And so these represent a fixed time commitment or time block. These are going to be used for keeping track of any task or event that has a time component. So anything that has a due date, a start date, or anything you need to be reminded of, we're going to be using an event. And you use it when something needs to happen at a specific time or within a specific time window. 2 tips to keep in mind when using events. At least for me, the calendar is just for noting when things happen. The tasks is where you describe what is supposed to happen. And I generally don't like to mix these. For me, calendars are really about reminding me when things are due, when I need to start them, when I'm supposed to be doing them. But actually describing what that activity is should not go in the calendar or whatever calendar component you're using. At least that's the way that I do it. Now, that's obviously going to depend on what type of software you're using. With some software, you can actually do this and it works. But with most of the calendar-based software, it's generally a bad idea. People try to then use their calendar as their entire engine for productivity. And in my experience, it's just generally not a great approach because calendar software is not really designed to handle tasks or notes or other types of information. So this tip really does depend on which software you're using. In some, you can do this. In most, you generally can't. It's just a bad idea. And lastly, you want to make sure you reserve the calendar for real commitments or time blocks, not just dumping everything in there, all your tasks, all your reminders, all your to-dos inside your calendar. You're probably going to drive yourself crazy and it's going to be very difficult to manage. Like I said, the way I like to think about calendars and events in the calendar are that they're really just reminders. It's kind of my alarm system that lets me know, hey, this is due, or this is coming up next, or you're supposed to be doing this now, that sort of thing. So I get the alert, the notification, whatever it is, and then I switch over to the main body of my productivity system. Next, we have tags or labels. And as you can imagine, there are a ridiculous amount of different types of tags and labels. So that's why I group them all into one single thing and consider that as its own primitive. And so what are tags? They're metadata that can be applied and used to filter items in a multitude of ways. They're also useful for discovery and providing context on a specific note, task, project. You can really apply this anywhere. So that's why I consider them metadata. So what are tags really good for? They're good for classifying items on single or multiple dimensions, depending on what you're going to use them for. And you can then use this metadata to do all kinds of really useful and interesting things like creating filters, saving queries, creating dashboards, all kinds of things. And so you would generally use tags whenever you need a way to group or find items based on multiple dimensions. And so that's why we use folders for the high-level categories, and we use tags for the low-level categories. The things that might be changing over time, like what project does this item belong to? What is the priority? Who has been assigned to it? What is the status of this item? Those things are going to be constantly changing, and that's why generally we want to use tags for those. Some tips on using tags are to make sure you maintain tag consistency and document their use somewhere. If you use or have used tags in any of your systems, probably well aware of how easy it is to come up with 100 different ways of saying the same thing and then finding you don't remember which tag you used. Was it hashtag important? Was it hashtag high? Was it hashtag priority? You don't remember, and so now you can't find the things you're looking for. So one of the ways you can avoid that is by documenting them somewhere, creating an index of all your tags you can then reference if you're ever unsure of which one to use or which ones are available. So that also means you generally want to keep tag creation to a minimum and only do it if it's necessary. An important caveat to this tip is that we're talking about productivity systems. We're not really talking about knowledge management systems, even though there is some overlap and some knowledge management systems double as productivity systems. And so in that case, you might have part of your system ignore this tip because it makes sense. You are trying to group notes and you're using tags to do that. But for the productivity part of your system, you definitely want to try and keep them to a minimum. Only do it if it's necessary. Don't just create 100 different tags to mean the same thing. And the last primitive we're going to look at is the template. It's essentially a skeleton, a reusable structure that is standardized for work that you do over and over. Using tags does a couple of things for us. It makes it easy to get started. It makes sure we're consistent. It's almost like a checklist, really. And so that generally improves the quality of those activities. We're using the same structure to do it the same way every time. And if our template is set up correctly, we're going to be able to maintain the same level of quality. Obviously, that depends on how good your template is, but if it's good, then you can expect good quality outputs. You want to use a template anytime you find yourself doing the same thing over and over. And if that thing you're doing has multiple steps, you're having to reference documents, look at websites, pull information from different sources. Basically, you're saving yourself a bunch of time by doing that work up front, creating a template you can use in the future, and then just using it whenever you need to do that. Some tips on using templates: you want to keep them minimal and editable. And by that, I mean you want to set them up for your future you that's going to use them. Anywhere you can make it easy to then just fill in the blanks for when you use it, it's going to save you a lot of time. You also generally want to include instructions or comments in the template, especially if it's something that's a bit complicated or involved. And that's a good idea, even if it's just you that's going to be using these templates, because you never know when you might stop using them and then have to use them again in the future, open them up and then be completely unsure of what to do or how to use them. And so the time and consideration that you used to put them together is going to be wasted, because you have to go back, retrace your steps, and remember, why did I set it up this way? What is this thing supposed to be? How am I supposed to use it? Better just to go ahead and leave yourself some instructions, some comments. It's a lot easier to delete those when you're going through the template than have to remember, what was I supposed to use this for? And the last tip I'll leave you with for templates is that it's generally better to consolidate multiple templates that have a similar output instead of having, say, 5 or 10 templates that are almost identical, except maybe they differ in one section here, one section there. It's probably just better to consolidate them. Makes it a lot easier for you to remember that it's there, and it's more likely that you'll actually use a template. And that's it. We've gone through all the primitives, or at least the ones that I consider primitives. Feel free to disagree with me. If you think some of these shouldn't actually be primitives, or I'm missing a couple, that's fine. I'm really just trying to give everyone a solid base from which we can build on as I explain the next steps in designing our productivity system. And so it's very likely we're going to see those things that maybe you consider are missing from here as components or as part of the process or something like that. So we will get to it and I will explain it. It's just that I've maybe categorized it in a slightly different way that makes sense to you. All right, so I hope that was still a little bit interesting. It's always good to just remind ourselves of these things, that they're available. We can use them as ingredients in our productivity system. This is going to form the base for our next video, where I show how we take these primitives and start to combine them into what I like to call components. And you could almost think of these as like little modular pieces that start to click together. So one way to think about it is, if these primitives represent like the little Lego blocks that start to snap together, the components then represent entire modules. So we're slowly getting to the part where we can put these things together based on our needs. So that's it. Be sure you don't miss the next videos where things really start to get interesting. And I describe the different ways you can combine these. What are they supposed to be doing for you? When might you want to use one versus another based on the type of things you're trying to do? So things are going to start to get very interesting very quick. So be sure to subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss that. Until then, I will see you in the next video.